Okay, so I'm going to take you guys through the beginnings of our next lecture, which again, this is an old lecture from an old textbook that I taught called The American Pageant, as you can see there. This is sort of the second half of what we would call the Road to Revolution. We've already talked about a little bit of this stuff, so some of it will be a little bit quicker than normal. All of it actually be a little bit quicker than normal. But as always, you need to make sure you're jotting a few things down. The benefit to this is that you can pause the video and then restart or go back or whatever you need to do to make sure that you get material written down that you need to get written down. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into this. So it talks about here that really from the beginnings of European exploration, America was sort of a revolutionary force. And a lot of that has to do with, you want to think of the New World as almost like a blank canvas that individuals can sort of do with what they wanted in a lot of different ways. And so we have this idea of republicanism. And you can see the definition there, which again, you don't necessarily need to write down again. But the idea behind republicanism is that individuals will sacrifice their self-interests sort of for the common good. That's sort of the core tenet of republicanism. And I'm going to try to move my, so I don't know if that's going to stay for the whole time or not, but there you can see the rest of that there. The idea that, stability in government depends on virtue, depends on how good are your citizens. Are your citizens basically good people? If they are, then republicanism can work. If they're not, then you have some issues there with republicanism. But that's sort of the idea here that really sort of takes root in America, really from the beginning of European exploration, is this idea of republicanism. Now, here you have sort of some of the ways that we would define virtue: selflessness, self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency meaning that you can take care of yourself. You don't need to rely on others to do anything for you. You can feed yourself. You can clothe yourself. That's going to give way later to the image of the American self-made man or self-made woman, as it were. But then also courage. A lot of this stuff takes a lot of courage to be able to strike out on your own and be selfless and be self-sufficient. But then also the last one, and this is important, is this appetite or this desire to be involved with the community around you. That's what we mean when we say civic involvement, is the community around you. And this all flies in the face of what we would call authoritarian institutions like monarchy. Monarchy would be that rule by kings, direct rule by kings or sole rule by kings. The aristocracy then would be sort of that hierarchical class system that we've talked about before. Republicanism flies in the face of that. It's opposed to that. Republicanism is, we would call it a meritocracy, meaning that you advance in society not based on your last name, not based on your place and rank within society, but you have the ability to make of yourself whatever you want based on the virtues that are listed here. And that's really what takes roots in the colony. That's really what takes root here in the colonies. Really, from the time that we have European exploration, we begin to see to see the roots of this begin to develop. Now, there is within British, political circles, and we're not going to get too deep into the weeds on this, so we're going to sort of go briefly by. You'll hear me use this term radical Whigs. And these are essentially individuals within the British government that are scared of this idea of republicanism. They feel that too much freedom, too much agency, too much power in the hands of the common person is dangerous to that sort of more arbitrary idea that monarchs and aristocracy should be in charge, because they feel that citizens can be corrupted in order to have their liberties taken away. They sort of don't have a fundamental trust in sort of the individual citizen and their virtue and their education and things like that. So you'll hear that term Whig or radical Whig thrown out there. And that's what we're talking about. It's a group of people that are really fundamentally opposed to this idea of republicanism. Now, and we already talked about this a little bit, because of the distance from Britain. You're talking about the entirety of the Atlantic Ocean. Because of the distance, the American colonies had really grown very accustomed to just sort of running things on their own. Sort of, they had a little bit more measure of autonomy than did sort of the colonies in India, the colonies in Africa, which there aren't a ton of colonies in Africa yet, but we're moving in that direction. But Americans have sort of grown accustomed to this. The American colonists, we can sort of run our own systems of government. We can run our own legislatures to make local laws. There's a certain amount of localism that's at play here, all within sort of the umbrella authority of British authority. But over time, that authority, that overarching authority of Britain, becomes weaker and weaker as Americans grow more and more accustomed to being able to sort of govern and manage their own affairs. And that becomes very important right around the time now of the French and Indian War. And a lot of those things that we talked about when we talked through the 7 Years' War, the colonists begin to have these ideas of we're kind of self-sufficient. We can take care of ourselves to a certain extent. It's important to point out here once again that while the American colonists maybe had grown accustomed to running their own, it says they're running their own affairs, and running their own businesses, running their local governments, they did not at all desire to break away from Britain in totality. They still very much thought of themselves as British citizens. But they also recognized that British authority became weaker and weaker with both the physical distance of an ocean, but then also the distance of time over the course of their sort of short history. So those seeds of discontent then get magnified a little bit. Well, if we're not happy with the British government, the way that things are going, then maybe we can break away. And so those are sort of the republicanism, the backdrop of the weakening of British authority is really what brings the revolution to bear. Now, the other thing that becomes very critical to the story is the idea of mercantilism. And I think we talked about mercantilism before, but we are going to sort of go back into it again just to make sure that we have a really good grasp of it. Mercantilism is this idea, essentially, and that line there that you see right underneath mercantilism, it's the belief that wealth is power, that ultimately a nation is only as powerful as it is wealthy. So this stems into military power, political power. It all comes back to economics. It all comes back essentially to how wealthy is your country. Now, a lot of this has to do with what we call hard specie, and that's where it talks about amassing gold and silver. Essentially, what you're looking for here is a favorable balance of trade. That's really kind of a key phrase here. With regard to mercantilism, is balance of trade. Are we importing less than we're exporting? We want to be exporting more, because if we're exporting, that means that we're selling those goods to other powers, and if we're selling goods, then we're bringing money in. Whereas when we import, we're bringing goods in, but we're also letting go of money, obviously, in exchange for those goods. So the idea of balance of trade here is important, because we want more exports than we have imports. And if we can do that, we're going to begin to amass that hard specie, that hard currency, and that is going to make our nation more and more powerful. So mercantilism comes into play because the colonies any colonies, not just the American colonies, but any colonies give very, very big advantages, because those colonies supply raw materials to what is called the mother country, in this case, Great Britain. But certainly the French are engaged in this. The Dutch are engaged in this, the Spanish. So it's not just Britain. Now, in the case of the American colonies, Britain is sort of our mother country. The colonies can supply those raw materials, and that reduces the need for foreign imports. So if we can get lumber, for example, from the colonies, we don't have to import it now from, say, France, or from, say, the Netherlands. We can get it from our colonies, and we don't have to get it what we call at market price. And I've drawn this before, I believe, on the board, but you have that supply and demand sort of back and forth. You can sort of disregard supply and demand when you have colonies, because the colonies, you can get those materials for whatever price you deem fair. The market has no play in it at all. And then you can turn around and you can sell your finished goods to those colonies. It's a guarantee. That's a guaranteed market for your exports. And again, when you get those exports, you're not going to cut any deals. You're going to sell it at market price now, or maybe even slightly above market price. And you can do that because you control where those colonies get their materials from. So the London government really sort of views the American colony. It says there as tenants. Tenants are people that sort of rent space. They view the colonists really as sort of tenants. They view the land as a part of the British Empire, and the colonists are really just staking out a claim on it. Now, Parliament will step in occasionally, and this is where we get into that salutary neglect, and this is going to sort of begin a theme that will continue when we see each other again on Thursday. But the Navigation Law of 1650, basically what it does is it says they're Dutch shippers, but really any foreign power that wants to engage in trade with the colonies, everything has to go through British authority. Okay, so any commerce that goes in and out of the colonies has to go through the British government. So in a lot of cases, if goods were coming from Europe to the colonies, they would first have to go through Britain. They would land in Britain. They would be taxed, and then sort of that allows the British middlemen to get your sort of British merchants to get their profits, and then they're sent along their way to the American colonies. They're sent along their way to the American colonies. It's sort of a way of siphoning off a little bit of extra money to those British merchants, and then once they get to the colonies, then these European powers have to pay whatever tax, import tax, the individual colonies may have. So it's all about sort of increasing that favorable balance of trade, and it all runs through London. Okay, it all runs through Britain. I think we're going to get through these last two slides, and then we'll wrap up for this lecture. Laws then also sort of they identify these things called enumerated products. Basically, these are products that American merchants, when they are then shipping out to European powers, they have to ship them to Britain first, and really in a lot of cases only. Okay, the only place that you can sell your tobacco, for example, as it says on the slide, is in Britain. You can't sell it anywhere else. It eliminates that market competition. So again, these are, in technicality, imports for Britain, but because they're eliminating the rest of the free market, they can import those for whatever low price they want. And this also influences a currency shortage in the colonies, a paper or a fiat currency shortage, which is an issue because now you are going to have individuals that are going to struggle to pay any other taxes or any other assessments that they may be levied. And the colonies have to start issuing more and more paper money, which leads to inflation. So there's a lot of bad stuff economically that's going on in the colonies. And to a certain extent, a lot of the original colonists are to a certain extent okay with this because, again, they see themselves as British. And this is just a part of what we're called to do as British citizens. I don't necessarily like it, but it's just part of it. But then what starts happening is Parliament begins to issue controls on colonial legislatures that say you cannot print paper currency. So again, this is where you start to see those seeds begin to pop up. You give us a little bit, but then you take it right back. The idea of nullification, that the crown can nullify any laws that are passed by those colonial assemblies, especially if it harms that mercantilist system, right? And again, it doesn't the royal veto, it says there, it doesn't get used very often. It gets used very, very sparingly. It's more just the idea. We're getting very angry over these ideas, right? Um, so it doesn't even have to get used. It's just the fact that it's there that really gets a lot of the colonists hot and bothered. So we're going to stop there. Again, I'm going to be checking your notes, make sure that you took some notes on this. And then we're going to continue here when we're back together on Thursday. So I hope you guys have a great e-learning day, and we'll see each other on Thursday.